Sometimes the very thing that breaks us is the only thing that can make us whole again. Deep in the Cascade Mountains, where winter silence swallows all sound except the whisper of falling snow, Ezra Blackwood heard the impossible. A wolf's cry echoing up from Eagle's Drop, the deadliest cliff face in 3 counties. For 12 years he'd lived alone in these mountains, a ghost haunting his own life, seeking penance for the mistake that cost his 8-year-old daughter everything. The wolf shouldn't have survived the fall. Nothing ever did. But there it was, silver-grey fur matted with blood, amber eyes that seemed to look straight through him, with an intelligence that made his hands tremble. As a former veterinarian, Ezra knew wolves. This one was different, wrong somehow, yet achingly familiar. Over the next 38 days, as he fought to save the creature's life, the wolf would do something far more profound. It would force him to confront the question that had driven him to these mountains in the first place. Can redemption come from the most unexpected places, even when we've given up on ourselves completely? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind cut through the pines like a blade, carrying with it the metallic scent of fresh blood, and something else, something that made the hair on the back of Ezra's neck stand on end. He crouched at the edge of Eagle's Drop, his weathered hands gripping the icy stone as he peered down into the white abyss below. The wolf lay motionless on a narrow ledge 60 feet down, its massive frame crumpled against the black rock like a discarded shadow. Ezra's breath came in sharp puffs that crystallized and vanished in the February air. In 12 years of solitude, he'd seen plenty of things fall from this cliff, deer spooked by hunters, an occasional bear cub that wandered too close to the edge, even a wayward hiker who'd ignored the warning signs. None had survived. The drop was too far. The rocks too unforgiving. The mountain too hungry for that kind of mercy. Yet there the wolf was, chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Leave it, his rational mind whispered. Nature doesn't need your interference. Haven't you done enough damage? But his legs were already moving, carrying him toward the narrow game trail that switchbacked down the cliff face. His boots found purchase on ice-slicked stone, with the muscle memory of a man who'd spent more than a decade navigating these treacherous paths. The silence pressed against his eardrums like water, broken only by the soft crunch of snow beneath his feet and the distant whisper of wind through the canyon. The wolf didn't stir as Ezra approached, though its eyes tracked his movement with an alertness that sent a chill down his spine. Those eyes, amber like honey held up to sunlight, were too knowing, too aware for a creature that should have been deep in shock or unconscious from pain. When Ezra knelt beside it, the wolf's gaze never wavered, never showed the wild panic he expected from an injured predator cornered by a human. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though he wasn't entirely certain of the wolf's sex from this angle. The words felt rusty in his throat, unused to breaking the mountain's eternal quiet. "Let me see what we're dealing with here." His hands moved with the careful precision of someone who'd once made his living treating wounded animals. The wolf's left hind leg was clearly shattered, bone visible through torn flesh, but the injury was clean, too clean for a fall from this height. Ezra frowned, running his fingers along the fracture line. It looked almost surgical, as if the bone had been broken with deliberate care rather than the chaotic violence of impact. The wolf whimpered, a sound so soft and achingly familiar that Ezra's hands stilled. He'd heard that exact sound before, in another life, from another creature he'd failed to save. He pushed the memory away before it could take root. "Don't go there. Not now." But as he examined the rest of the wolf's injuries, mostly superficial cuts and bruising, his mind kept circling back to that sound. Sarah had made the same soft whimper the night she'd been brought into the emergency clinic, her small body broken by a different kind of fall, her eyes holding that same impossible trust even as the life leaked out of her. The wolf shifted, trying to rise, and Ezra placed a gentle hand on its massive head. The creature stilled immediately, as if it understood his touch, trusted it even. Its fur was coarser than he expected, silver-gray with darker streaks, that reminded him of storm clouds. But it was warm beneath his palm, vibrantly alive despite the trauma. "You shouldn't have survived this," he said quietly, more to himself than to the wolf. "Nothing survives Eagle's Drop. That's why they call it—" He stopped, the words dying in his throat as the wolf's ears pricked forward, as if it were listening not just to his voice, but to something deeper, some meaning beneath the words. Snow began to fall again, fat flakes that landed on the wolf's fur and melted instantly from the heat of its body. Ezra glanced up at the darkening sky, calculating. The storm that had been threatening all morning was finally arriving, and if he was going to get this animal to shelter, it had to be now. The game trail would become impassable within the hour, and exposure would finish what the fall had started. He'd sworn off this kind of intervention years ago. After Sarah, after the mistakes and the guilt and the unbearable weight of playing God with lives that weren't his to save, he'd retreated to these mountains precisely to avoid moments like this. The hermit's life he'd built was simple, clean, free from the complications that came with caring. But as he looked into those amber eyes that seemed to hold not just intelligence but recognition, as if the wolf knew him somehow, Ezra felt something crack inside his chest. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the loneliness finally getting to him after all these years. Or maybe it was the way the wolf's breathing had synchronized with his own, the way its trust felt like both a gift and a burden he wasn't sure he deserved. "Damn it," Ezra whispered, the curse lost in the mounting wind. He stripped off his heavy wool coat, ignoring the bite of cold through his flannel shirt. The wolf's eyes never left his face as he wrapped the garment around its injured body, careful not to jostle the shattered leg. "This is a mistake. We both know this is a mistake." The wolf made no sound, but something in its gaze seemed almost grateful. Ezra shook his head, dispelling the ridiculous notion. Anthropomorphizing wounded animals was the first sign of a veterinarian losing his edge, and he'd lost his edge 13 years ago in a sterile examination room that smelled of antiseptic and failure. Lifting the wolf required every ounce of strength left in his 58-year-old frame. The animal had to weigh close to 140 pounds, massive even by grey wolf standards, but it remained utterly still in his arms, trusting him with a faith that made his chest tight. The ascent up the game trail became a meditation in controlled breathing and careful footwork, each step calculated to avoid jarring the injured leg further. By the time Ezra reached his cabin, the snow was falling in thick curtains that reduced visibility to mere yards. The small log structure sat in a clearing he'd carved from the wilderness with his own hands, its chimney already smoking from the morning fire he'd banked before his ill-fated hike. Solar panels gleamed dully on the south-facing roof, barely visible through the accumulating snow. It wasn't much, but it had been home for 12 years, longer than anywhere else since Sarah died. Inside, the cabin's single room felt cramped with the wolf's presence. Ezra had designed the space for solitude. A narrow bed pushed against the far wall, a small kitchen area with a propane stove and mini refrigerator, shelves lined with veterinary textbooks he couldn't bring himself to throw away, and a stone fireplace that provided both heat and the hypnotic comfort of flame. The only personal touches were a faded photograph on the mantel, a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, and a guitar that hadn't been played in years. He cleared his small dining table with one sweep of his arm, sending months of accumulated mail and supply catalogues cascatering to the floor. The wolf watched his every movement as he spread clean towels across the wooden surface, those amber eyes tracking him with an intensity that raised goosebumps along his arms. "Okay, girl," he murmured, lifting the wolf onto the makeshift examination table. "Let's see what we're really dealing with." His veterinary supplies lived in a wooden chest beneath his bed, organized with the same obsessive care he'd once brought to his practice in Seattle. Syringes, antibiotics, surgical instruments, splinting materials, all kept pristine and current despite his retirement. Old habits died hard, especially the ones that might matter when death came calling in the wilderness. The wolf's breathing had grown shallower during the journey, shock finally setting in. Ezra worked with methodical efficiency, starting in 4-line and administering pain medication. The animal never flinched, never tried to bite, even when he began cleaning the wounds. It was almost as if she understood what he was trying to do. He'd confirmed the wolf's sex during his examination, though something about thinking of her in feminine terms made his hands shake slightly. Sarah had always wanted a dog, had begged for one every birthday and Christmas until— "Focus," he told himself aloud, the sound of his own voice startling in the cabin's silence. The wolf's ears twitched at the sound, and for a moment Ezra could have sworn she was listening not just to his words, but to the pain beneath them. Setting the broken leg required more strength than his aging body wanted to give. The bone fragments had to be aligned perfectly, held in place while he applied the splint. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cabin's chill, and his lower back screamed from bending over the improvised operating table. But his hands remained steady. Muscle memory from thousands of similar procedures performed when such things mattered, when healing something felt possible rather than futile. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows and sending occasional gusts down the chimney that made the fire dance. This was exactly the kind of weather that could trap him for days, cut off from the outside world he'd been avoiding anyway. His monthly supply runs to the small town of Cascade Falls, 40 miles down the mountain, were the only human contact he maintained. Even then, he spoke only to Earl at the general store and Martha at the post office, brief, functional exchanges that never strayed into personal territory. As he finished bandaging the wolf's leg, exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. He'd been running on adrenaline since finding her at the bottom of Eagle's Drop, but now the weight of what he'd committed to settled on his shoulders. Caring for a wild animal, especially one this size, would mean weeks of constant attention, sleepless nights, and the kind of emotional investment he'd spent 12 years learning to avoid. The wolf's breathing had steadied, her eyes finally closing as the pain medication took full effect. In sleep, she looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way that made Ezra's throat constrict. He pulled a blanket over her still form and settled into his reading chair by the fire, knowing he wouldn't sleep tonight. Outside, the mountain howled its ancient song of isolation and endurance. Inside, for the first time in years, Ezra Blackwood was no longer alone. Ezra dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake every hour to check on his patient. The wolf's breathing remained steady, though she whimpered occasionally in her drugged sleep, soft sounds that cut through him like glass. Each time he rose to adjust her blanket or check her pulse, those amber eyes would flutter open briefly, tracking his movements with an awareness that seemed to pierce straight through to his bones. The storm reached its full fury sometime after midnight, transforming the world beyond his windows into a white maelstrom. Wind shrieked around the cabin's corners with voices that sounded almost human, and snow piled against the glass in drifts that would take days to melt. Ezra had weathered dozens of such storms in his 12 years on the mountain, but tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made his skin crawl, and his thoughts turn to things better left buried. It was during one of his hourly checks, around 3 in the morning, that he noticed it. The wolf had shifted in her sleep, the blanket sliding down to reveal her left shoulder blade. There, barely visible through the thick fur, was a mark Ezra had missed during his initial examination, a crescent-shaped patch of white hair against the darker gray. It was small, perhaps the size of a quarter, perfectly formed like a tiny moon carved into her coat. Ezra's breath caught in his throat. His legs gave out, sending him stumbling backward until he hit the wall, his vision tunneling to that single, impossible detail. The coffee mug in his hand slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the cabin floor. Sarah had been born with a birthmark in exactly that spot, a pale crescent on her left shoulder blade that she'd been self-conscious about until he'd told her it meant she was marked by the moon, chosen for something special. She'd worn it like a badge of honor after that, showing it off to anyone who would look. "No," he whispered to the empty cabin, the word barely audible over the storm's roar. "No, that's not. It's just a coincidence. Animals have markings. It doesn't mean anything." But his hands were shaking as he knelt to clean up the broken ceramic, and his mind was already spiraling into territory he'd forbidden himself to explore. The wolf's strange calmness during treatment, those two intelligent eyes that seemed to recognize him, the soft whimper that had sounded exactly like... The wolf stirred, lifting her massive head to look directly at him. In the firelight, her gaze held depths that made Ezra's rational mind rebel against what he was seeing. This was a wild animal, nothing more, a creature driven by instinct and survival, not some supernatural vessel for his grief and guilt. Yet as he stared into those amber depths, a name rose unbidden from the deepest part of his heart. Sarah. The word escaped his lips as barely a breath, but the wolf's ears pricked forward immediately. Her head tilted slightly to one side, the exact gesture his daughter had made when she was listening carefully to something important. For a moment that stretched like eternity, neither of them moved. Then the wolf whimpered again, that same soft sound of recognition and need, and Ezra felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble. "This is madness," he said aloud, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been hope. "I'm talking to a wolf. I'm seeing things that aren't there because I've been alone too long, because guilt makes people crazy, because..." But even as he listed all the rational explanations, he found himself moving closer to the table. The wolf watched him approach with those impossibly knowing eyes, and when he reached out to touch the crescent mark on her shoulder, she leaned into his touch like she had 1,000 times before. The fur was warm beneath his palm, real and solid and alive. But the mark itself seemed to pulse with its own heat, as if something deep and fundamental recognized his touch. Ezra's chest constricted with a pain so sharp it nearly doubled him over. Outside, the storm began to ease, its fury spent against the mountain's indifference. But inside the cabin, Ezra faced a choice that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the world and his place in it. He could treat this as what it appeared to be, a wounded animal that bore a coincidental resemblance to his lost daughter. He could nurse the wolf back to health and release her into the wild, returning to his hermit-esque existence, with nothing changed except perhaps a small satisfaction at having saved one life. Or he could acknowledge what every instinct screamed was impossible, follow this thread wherever it led, and risk discovering truths that might destroy what little peace he'd managed to carve from his exile. The wolf's breathing deepened as the pain medication pulled her back toward sleep. But her eyes remained fixed on his face, waiting with infinite patience for him to decide which path he would take, the safe road of denial, or the terrifying journey toward answers he wasn't sure he was strong enough to face. Ezra jerked his hand back as if the wolf's fur had burned him, stumbling away from the makeshift examination table until his back hit the cabin wall. His heart hammered against his ribs with the desperate rhythm of a caged bird, and his breathing came in short, sharp gasps that fogged in the suddenly cold air. "This isn't happening," he whispered, pressing his palms against his eyes until stars burst behind his lids. Grief hallucinations. Isolation psychosis. There's a medical explanation for this. But even with his eyes squeezed shut, he could feel the wolf's gaze on him. Patient, knowing, waiting. The rational part of his mind, the part that had spent 30 years practicing veterinary medicine, catalogued all the perfectly logical reasons why he was seeing connections that didn't exist. Sleep deprivation could cause delusions. Chronic isolation led to anthropomorphizing animals. The stress of caring for another living thing after years of self-imposed exile was triggering memories better left buried. Yet when he opened his eyes, the wolf was still there, still watching him with those amber depths that reflected not just firelight, but something that looked disturbingly like recognition. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to sedate her more heavily, splint the leg properly, and wait out the storm. Once the weather cleared, he could transport her to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center near Mount Vernon. Let someone else deal with the complications of a healing predator. Return to his careful solitude where the only life he could destroy was his own. "That's what I should do," he said to the empty cabin, his voice sounding strange after the long silence. "That's the responsible choice." The wolf's head tilted at the sound of his voice, and Ezra felt his resolve crumble. That gesture, so perfectly familiar it made his chest ache, was exactly how Sarah used to listen when he'd read to her before bed. The same slight angle of the head, the same focused attention, as if every word mattered. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold floor, knees drawn up to his chest like a man trying to make himself small enough to disappear. "I can't do this again," he whispered. "I can't care about something I'm going to lose." The memories came flooding back despite his attempts to hold them at bay. Sarah, at 6 years old, begging him to fix her broken toy rabbit. Sarah at 8, helping him tend to injured wildlife in their Seattle backyard. Sarah at 10, announcing she wanted to be a veterinarian just like Daddy so she could save all the hurt animals in the world. And then Sarah at 11, lying on a cold metal table while he stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to think, unable to be the father and the doctor she needed him to be. The aneurysm had been impossible to predict, the rupture swift and devastating. But in those crucial first minutes, when quick action might have made a difference, he'd hesitated. Paralyzed by the dual roles of parent and physician, he'd lost precious seconds that haunted him still. "I failed her," he said, the words scraping his throat raw. "I had the knowledge, the skills, the responsibility to save her, and I failed. How can I trust myself with anything again?" The wolf made a soft sound, not quite a whine, not quite a growl. When Ezra looked up, she was watching him with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic, as if she understood his pain in ways that defied explanation. The storm outside continued its assault on the cabin, but the wind's howl had taken on a different quality, less furious, more mournful. Snow piled against the windows in drifts that would take days to clear, effectively trapping him with this impossible situation. No escape route, no way to transfer responsibility to someone else. Just him, the wolf, and the growing certainty that nothing about this was coincidence. "What if I'm wrong again?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the wolf, to himself, or to the ghost of his daughter that seemed to linger in the cabin's shadows. What if I make the wrong choice, give the wrong treatment, wait too long or act too fast? What if caring about you destroys us both? The wolf shifted on the table, her movement careful and deliberate despite the injuries. Her amber eyes never left his face, and in their depths, Ezra saw something that made his breath catch. Not just intelligence, but patience. The kind of infinite, forgiving patience Sarah had always shown him, even when his work kept him away too many evenings, even when his fears made him overprotective. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending dancing shadows across the cabin walls. In those shifting patterns of light and dark, Ezra could almost see the shape of choices yet unmade. The safe path led back to isolation, to the careful numbness he'd cultivated for 12 years. The other path, the terrifying one that acknowledged what his heart was telling him, led into unknown territory where the rules of the world he thought he knew no longer applied. The wolf settled her massive head on her paws, still watching, still waiting. Her breathing was steady now, the crisis point passed, but Ezra knew his own crisis was just beginning. In a few hours he would have to choose which man he wanted to be, the broken hermit who'd given up on healing, or someone brave enough to face the impossible. The fire had burned low, casting wavering shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. Ezra remained on the floor, his back against the wall, watching the wolf breathe in the steady rhythm of medicated sleep. Dawn was still hours away, but something fundamental had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for his decision. He thought about the easy choices first. The practical voice in his head whispered all the reasonable options: sedate her more heavily, wait for the storm to pass, call the wildlife center. Let someone else bear the weight of responsibility. Someone who hadn't already failed when it mattered most. But as he watched the wolf's chest rise and fall, that crescent-shaped marking visible even in the dying firelight, Ezra felt the last of his defenses crumble. This wasn't about logic anymore. It wasn't about medical protocols or rational explanations for impossible coincidences. It was about a choice he'd been running from for 12 years, the choice to risk everything on the possibility of redemption. Sarah always believed in second chances, he whispered to the darkness. His daughter had forgiven him countless times for missed dinners, forgotten recitals, the endless parade of emergencies that had pulled him away from home. Even when his work consumed him, even when his fears made him overprotective, she'd never doubted his love. He pushed himself up from the floor, his joints protesting after hours of sitting on the cold wood. The wolf's eyes opened as he approached the table, tracking his movement with that unsettling intelligence. This close, he could see flecks of gold in the amber depths, constellations that reminded him of the glow-in-the-dark stars Sarah had insisted on pasting to her bedroom ceiling. "I don't know what you are," he said softly, his hand hovering inches above the wolf's head. "I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something impossible is happening here, but I know I can't walk away, not this time." The wolf's ears pricked forward at his words, and when he finally let his palm rest against her fur, she leaned into his touch with a trust that nearly broke him. Her coat was coarse but warm, pulsing with life that felt precious beyond measure. He could feel her heartbeat against his fingertips, strong, steady, determined to keep fighting. Outside, the storm was beginning to exhaust itself. The wind's shriek had diminished to a mournful whisper, and the snow fell more gently against the windows. But Ezra barely noticed the weather's change. He was too focused on the moment of commitment crystallizing in his chest, not just to healing the wolf's body, but to following this impossible thread wherever it might lead. "I'll need to monitor you constantly for the next few days," he murmured, already mentally cataloging the supplies he'd need, the schedule of medications, the signs of infection or complications to watch for. "Your leg will take weeks to heal properly, and there's always the risk of pneumonia in trauma cases." He was talking to fill the silence, but also to anchor himself in the familiar rituals of care. This was work, he understood, even if everything else defied explanation. He could focus on the medical realities, keeping her hydrated, managing her pain, preventing secondary infections. Let the larger questions wait until she was stable. The wolf's breathing deepened as the pain medication pulled her back towards sleep, but her eyes remained fixed on his face. In that gaze, Ezra saw something that made his throat constrict with emotion he'd spent years suppressing. It wasn't just trust, it was recognition, as if she'd been waiting for him to make this choice, to step across the threshold from observer to participant in whatever strange dance fate had choreographed. "I won't let you down," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of every promise he'd ever broken, every moment he'd arrived too late or acted too slowly. "Whatever this costs me, whatever it means, I won't give up on you." As if responding to his vow, the wolf's massive paw shifted slightly on the table, coming to rest against his wrist. The contact was warm and solid and real, grounding him in the present moment. For the first time in 12 years, Ezra felt the crushing weight of isolation lift from his shoulders. He was no longer the hermit of Cascade Mountains, running from his failures. He was a healer again, with a patient who needed him. The path ahead was uncharted territory, fraught with questions that might shatter everything he thought he understood about life and death and the spaces between them. But as he settled into the chair beside the table, preparing for another sleepless night of vigilant care, Ezra Blackwood crossed the threshold he'd been avoiding since the day his daughter died. There was no going back now. Whatever answers waited in those amber eyes, whatever truth lay behind that impossible marking, he would see it through to the end. The wolf's breathing shifted into the deeper rhythms of true rest, but Ezra found sleep impossible. He moved between the chair and the kitchen, checking her pulse, adjusting the splint, brewing endless cups of coffee that grew cold untouched. Each time he thought he'd accepted what was happening, doubt would claw its way back to the surface, whispering that he was projecting his grief onto an injured animal, seeing patterns where none existed. It was during one of these restless circuits that he heard the sound, a low rumble from outside that made his blood freeze. Wolves. A pack calling to each other through the dying storm. The wounded wolf's head snapped up immediately, ears swiveling toward the sound. Her response was swift and unmistakable, a deep, resonant howl that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's wooden walls. Ezra watched in fascination and growing alarm as she answered the calls with complex vocalizations, her body tense despite her injuries. The pack's response was immediate and concerning. The howls grew closer, more insistent. Whatever communication was passing between them, it was drawing the wild wolves toward his cabin. "No," Ezra muttered, moving to the window. Through the swirling snow, he could make out dark shapes moving between the trees, at least 4 wolves, possibly more. "They'll try to reclaim you, won't they? And I can't release you like this. You'd die within hours." The injured wolf continued her calls, and Ezra realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't random vocalization, it was conversation. She was telling them something, and their responses suggested understanding, negotiation, even argument. As the shapes in the forest drew closer, Ezra faced his first real test. He could open the door, let nature take its course, trust that the pack would somehow care for their injured member. Or he could defend his decision to intervene, potentially putting himself against a group of wild predators. The choice was made for him when the alpha appeared at the edge of the clearing, a massive black wolf whose presence commanded immediate attention. Even the injured wolf fell silent, watching through the window as the pack leader approached the cabin with deliberate, measured steps. Ezra had never seen anything like it. The alpha stopped just outside the porch, yellow eyes fixed on the cabin door, and released a single authoritative howl. It wasn't a threat, it was a demand. "Return what belongs to us." "I can't," Ezra whispered, though he knew the animal couldn't understand him. "She'll die if I let her go now." The injured wolf stirred on the table, struggling to rise despite the splint. Her answering call was weaker, but filled with what sounded impossibly like explanation, argument. She was telling them something that made the alpha pace in tight circles, clearly agitated. For 20 minutes, the standoff continued. The pack maintained their positions while their injured member held court from inside the cabin, her vocalizations growing more complex and urgent. Ezra found himself caught in a struggle he'd never imagined, not just between wild nature and human intervention, but between 2 different kinds of intelligence, each with its own understanding of loyalty and survival. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the communication ceased. The alpha released one final howl, this one carrying unmistakable notes of reluctant acceptance, and melted back into the forest. The pack followed, their shapes disappearing into the snow-laden trees until only their scent remained. The cabin fell silent, except for the settling fire and the wolf's heavy breathing. She had collapsed back onto the table, exhausted by the exchange, but her eyes held something that made Ezra's skin prickle with unease. Satisfaction. As if she had negotiated something impossible and won. "What did you tell them?" he asked aloud, knowing how absurd the question sounded. "How did you convince a pack of wild wolves to leave without you?" She watched him with those 2 knowing eyes, and Ezra felt the last of his rational explanations slip away. This wasn't just unusual animal behavior. It was something that challenged everything he thought he understood about intelligence, communication, and the boundaries between species. The storm's final whispers died outside, leaving the mountain in profound silence. Dawn was still hours away, but Ezra knew he wouldn't sleep. The pack's visit had been a warning and a test, showing him that his decision to care for the injured wolf had consequences he hadn't considered. He wasn't just treating a patient. He was interfering with dynamics that operated by rules he didn't understand. Yet as he settled back into the chair beside the table, watching over the wolf who had somehow negotiated her own rescue, Ezra felt a strange sense of validation. Whatever was happening here, whatever impossible reality he'd stumbled into, he was no longer facing it alone. The wolf had chosen to stay, chosen to trust him over her own kind. The alliance was fragile, built on mysteries he couldn't solve, and trust he wasn't sure he deserved. But for the first time in 12 years, Ezra Blackwood was part of something larger than his own guilt and isolation. Whatever tests lay ahead, he would meet them with a partner whose intelligence might exceed his own. The silence that followed the pack's departure felt different from the isolation Ezra had grown accustomed to, heavier with possibility, charged with questions that demanded answers he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. He sat in the chair beside the makeshift examination table, studying the wolf who had somehow convinced her own kind to abandon her to his care. "You bought us time," he said quietly, watching her amber eyes track his movement as he reached for his medical journal. But time for what? The leather-bound notebook had been his companion through 12 years of solitude, filled with observations about weather patterns, wildlife behavior, and the careful documentation of his self-imposed exile. Now he found himself writing different kinds of entries, detailed notes about the wolf's injuries, yes, but also the troubling impossibilities he couldn't ignore. Day 3. Patient shows remarkable cognitive abilities. Pack interaction suggests complex communication beyond typical lupine vocalizations. Crescent marking remains unexplained. No signs of infection, but behavioral anomalies continue. He paused, pen hovering over the page. How did you document the impossible? How did you record the growing certainty that everything you'd believed about the boundaries between species, between intelligence and instinct, was crumbling? The wolf shifted on the table, and Ezra noticed she was favoring her right side more than expected. When he approached to examine her, she remained perfectly still, allowing his hands to probe the injured area with a trust that would have been remarkable in a domestic animal, let alone a wild predator. "Inflammation's increasing," he murmured, feeling the heat radiating through her thick coat. "I need to adjust your antibiotic dosage, maybe add a corticosteroid to manage the swelling." As he prepared the medications, Ezra found himself falling into the familiar rhythm of veterinary care. The precise measurements, the careful injection techniques, the constant monitoring for adverse reactions. This was work he understood, even if the patient defied every principle of wild animal behavior he'd learned in 30 years of practice. But as the day wore on, he began to notice changes that had nothing to do with her physical healing. The wolf was studying him with an intensity that went beyond wariness or gratitude. She watched his movements around the cabin, her gaze lingering on personal items he'd forgotten were visible, the framed photo of Sarah on the bookshelf, the child's drawing still pinned to the wall after all these years, the small wooden horse he'd carved during those first dark months of grief. When his eyes met hers while looking at Sarah's picture, the wolf's expression shifted into something that made his breath catch. Recognition. Not the vague awareness of one creature acknowledging another, but specific, deliberate recognition of something or someone known. "That's impossible," he whispered. But even as he spoke the words, he was moving toward the photograph. Sarah, at age 10, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while holding a rescued squirrel, her favorite denim jacket slipping off one shoulder to reveal the crescent-shaped birthmark she'd been self-conscious about. The wolf's breathing changed as he picked up the frame. Her ears pricked forward, and she made a soft sound, not quite a whine, not quite a whimper, that carried notes of something disturbingly like longing. Ezra's hands trembled as he carried the photograph closer to the table. "You recognize her, don't you? That's why you let me help you. That's why you convinced your pack to leave you here." His voice cracked on the words. "But that's impossible. Sarah died 13 years ago." The wolf's response was to stretch her neck forward, pressing her nose against the glass covering his daughter's image. The gesture was so gentle, so full of careful reverence, that tears began streaming down Ezra's face before he realized he was crying. "Who are you?" he whispered, setting the frame where she could see it clearly. "What are you?" Outside, the storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. But inside the cabin, Ezra felt the foundations of his understanding cracking under the weight of implications he wasn't ready to accept. The wolf's continued focus on Sarah's photograph, her impossible intelligence, the crescent marking that matched his daughter's birthmark exactly. It was all building toward a truth that challenged everything he thought he knew about death and what came after. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about projection, about grief-driven hallucinations and the human tendency to find patterns in chaos. But his healer's instincts, honed by decades of working with animals, recognized something deeper here. This wasn't coincidence or wishful thinking. This was preparation for a revelation that would either shatter his sanity or force him to expand his understanding of what was possible in a universe far stranger than he'd imagined. As afternoon light filtered through the snow-covered windows, casting everything in pale silver, Ezra realized he was no longer just caring for an injured wolf. He was being prepared for something that would test every belief he'd clung to through 12 years of exile. The wolf's presence wasn't random. It was an approach, a careful drawing near to truths that would demand everything he had left to give. The afternoon light faded into early evening, and with the growing darkness came the wolf's first real crisis. The fever hit without warning. One moment she was resting peacefully beside Sarah's photograph. The next, her body was burning with a heat that made Ezra's heart race with familiar terror. "No, no, no," he muttered, pressing his palm against her forehead. The temperature was dangerously high, her breathing rapid and shallow. This was the moment he dreaded most, the point where all his skill, all his careful preparation might not be enough. The wolf's eyes were glassy with pain, but even through the haze of fever, that unsettling intelligence remained. She watched him move frantically around the cabin, gathering ice packs and additional medications, her gaze tracking his every movement as if memorizing his face. Ezra had faced this crisis countless times in his veterinary career, but never with stakes that felt so impossibly personal. His hands shook as he prepared the injection of broad-spectrum antibiotics, knowing that if he miscalculated the dosage for her massive frame, he could kill her just as surely as the infection might. "I can't lose you," he whispered, finding the injection site along her thick neck. "Not when I don't understand what you are. Not when you're all I have left of—" He couldn't finish the thought. It was too dangerous, too close to admitting what his rational mind still refused to accept. The wolf remained perfectly still as the needle pierced her skin, as if she understood the gravity of the moment. But when Ezra met her eyes afterward, he saw something that made his breath catch. Not just trust, but a kind of patient resignation that reminded him devastatingly of Sarah's expression during those final hours in the hospital. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Sarah, at age 11, looking up at him from the hospital bed with that same calm acceptance while machines beeped frantically around them. "It's okay, Daddy," she'd whispered. "You tried your best. Sometimes things just happen." But they didn't just happen. He'd made the wrong call, chosen the wrong treatment protocol, let his fear of losing her cloud his judgment until the mistake became irreversible. And now, staring into the wolf's fevered eyes, Ezra felt the full weight of that failure crashing down on him again. "I won't make the same mistake twice," he said aloud. Though whether he was speaking to the wolf, to Sarah's memory, or to himself, he couldn't say. "Whatever it costs me, whatever I have to risk, I won't let my fear paralyze me again." The next 6 hours were a hell of vigilant care, unlike anything Ezra had experienced in his years of exile. The wolf's temperature spiked and dropped unpredictably, her body fighting an infection that seemed determined to claim her despite every intervention he attempted. He rotated ice packs constantly, administered 4 fluids, monitored her heart rate with an intensity that left his own hands cramping from exhaustion. Twice during the night, he thought he was losing her. Her breathing grew so shallow that he pressed his ear to her chest, listening desperately for the heartbeat that had become the center of his world. Each time, she rallied, just when he was preparing to accept defeat, her amber eyes finding his face as if drawing strength from his presence. It was during the 3rd crisis, around 4 in the morning, that the wolf did something that shattered the last of Ezra's rational defenses. As her temperature spiked again, as her body convulsed with fever-induced tremors, she lifted her massive head with tremendous effort and pressed her nose against his hand. The gesture was so deliberately human, so full of conscious gratitude, that Ezra finally spoke the words he'd been avoiding all night. "You're her, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice breaking with exhaustion and terror and desperate hope. "Somehow, impossibly, you're my Sarah." The wolf's response was to rest her head against his chest, just over his heart, exactly the way his daughter used to do when she was frightened or hurt. The weight was different, the texture of fur instead of silky hair, but the gesture was identical, seeking comfort in the safest place she knew. Ezra felt something fundamental shift inside him as he wrapped his arms around the wolf's massive form. All the careful distance he'd maintained, all the rational explanations he'd clung to, crumbled beneath the simple truth of that familiar gesture. Whatever laws of nature this violated, whatever impossibility he was embracing, he couldn't deny what his heart recognized. "I'm here," he whispered into her fur, the same words he'd spoken 13 years ago in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and dying hope. "I'm here, and I'm not letting go. Not this time." The fever broke just as dawn touched the snow-covered windows, the wolf's temperature dropping with a suddenness that left Ezra dizzy with relief. But even as her body cooled and her breathing steadied, he knew there was no returning to the careful skepticism that had protected him through the previous days. He had crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, accepted a truth that would either save them both or destroy what remained of his sanity. For 3 precious days after the fever broke, Ezra allowed himself to believe he had won. The wolf grew stronger, her appetite returned, and she began taking tentative steps around the cabin on her healing leg. More importantly, the impossible connection between them deepened. She would rest her head in his lap while he read aloud from Sarah's favorite books, respond to her name with subtle ear movements, and watch him with eyes that held all the warmth and intelligence he remembered from his daughter. But on the morning of day 19, everything began to unravel. Ezra woke to find the wolf standing at the window, her body rigid with an alertness that immediately set his nerves on edge. Outside, fresh snow had fallen during the night, and through the pristine white expanse, dark shapes moved with purposeful intent. The pack had returned. Not just the 4 or 5 wolves from before, but at least a dozen, their forms spread in a wide circle around the cabin. The alpha stood directly in Ezra's line of sight. Massive and unmoving, yellow eyes fixed on the window where the injured wolf waited. This wasn't the tentative approach of their first visit. This was a demand backed by overwhelming force. "They've come to take you back," Ezra whispered, his hand finding the wolf's fur. She turned to look at him, and in her amber eyes he saw something that made his chest tighten with dread, resignation. She had always known this moment would come. The wolf moved to the door, her gait still slightly favored but strong enough for travel. She looked back at Ezra once, her expression conveying everything words couldn't, gratitude, sorrow, and an apology for what was about to be taken from him. Then she waited, clearly expecting him to open the door and release her to her waiting family. No. The word tore from his throat with desperate force. "I won't let you go, not now. Not when I finally understand what you are." But even as he spoke, Ezra knew he had no choice. The wolf was wild, belonged to something larger than his desperate need for connection, and despite her injuries, despite the impossible bond between them, she was choosing to leave. He could see it in the way she faced the door, in the subtle tension of her muscles preparing for departure. His hands shook as he reached for the latch. "Sarah," he whispered, using her name deliberately for the first time since that fever-broken night. "If you are her, if this is really you somehow, please don't leave me again. I can't survive losing you twice." The wolf turned at the sound of her name, and for a heartbeat, Ezra thought he saw hesitation in her eyes. But then the alpha's howl cut through the morning air, not a request this time, but a command that brooked no refusal. The pack was growing restless, their patience exhausted. With movements that felt like betrayal of everything he'd promised during those dark hours of fever, Ezra opened the door. The wolf stepped onto the porch, her breath steaming in the cold air. She took 3 steps toward the waiting pack, then stopped and looked back one final time. The expression in her amber eyes was so achingly familiar. The same look Sarah had given him from her hospital bed, full of love and forgiveness and goodbye. Then she was gone, bounding through the snow toward her pack with strength that should have made him proud, but instead felt like abandonment. The alpha waited until she reached the group, then led them all into the forest depths where Ezra's human presence couldn't follow. He stood in the doorway until long after the last wolf had disappeared, the cold seeping through his clothes and into his bones. The silence that settled over the cabin was different from the solitude he'd known before, not peaceful isolation, but the hollow emptiness of loss renewed. Inside, Sarah's photograph still sat where the wolf could see it from the table. Her favorite books lay open where Ezra had been reading aloud just the night before. The medical supplies were scattered across the counter, evidence of his desperate fight to save a life that had chosen to leave him anyway. 27 days. That's how long he'd had with her, if she had been her at all. Now, staring at the empty cabin that felt impossibly large without her presence, Ezra began to wonder if his grief-addled mind had simply created the connection he'd needed so desperately to believe in. Perhaps she had been nothing more than an injured wolf after all, and he had projected his dead daughter onto her because the alternative, accepting that Sarah was truly gone forever, was too painful to bear. The rational explanation should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like dying all over again. Ezra sank into the chair where he'd kept vigil through her fever, surrounded by the remnants of a miracle he could no longer trust had been real. The mountain's silence pressed in around him, no longer peaceful but accusatory, whispering that he had built his hope on delusion and lost what mattered most through his inability to hold on.